So while the progressive era has so many different reforms that are going on during it, there's also what are known as the progressive presidents. Two of them are Republicans, and one of them is a Democrat, which indicates that in many ways, progressives went across the two parties. So there were certainly policies in both parties that would be considered progressive. That being said, the two Republicans were more centrist than perhaps being sort of very, very conservative. So Teddy Roosevelt is going to be president until 1909. He could have run a third time. There's so much going on during the progressive era, so many different reforms. But the presidents that are president during this particular era are known as the progressive presidents. And as you'll see, two were Republicans. Teddy Roosevelt for almost two terms and then chose not to run again, which would have actually been his second full term since he took over after McKinley was assassinated. Taft for one term, and then Wilson for two terms. But we notice that the progressive ideas actually aren't necessarily associated with one party or the other during this time. So, first, we have to look at Teddy Roosevelt. We've seen this big stick policy before, certainly in regards to a cartoon that we saw for the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. You'll oftentimes see Teddy Roosevelt with a big stick, which was known as his big stick policy, just in terms of sort of getting stuff done. You'll also see him often pictured with a teddy bear as well. So, sort of aggressive, but also sort of cute at the same time. So Teddy promised the Americans what was known as a square deal. It's not because the deal had four sides or four elements. A square deal just basically means a fair deal. And it involved three C's: control of corporations, again, important control, not elimination, conservation of natural resources, and consumer protection. So obviously, we've already seen in terms of consumer protection the Pure Food and Drug Act, the Meat Inspection Act that really come out of the jungle. So we've sort of addressed that. We're going to look much more with Teddy with one and two on here. So when we look at monopolies, certainly a problem that we had seen throughout the Gilded Age: vertical integration, horizontal integration. We'd seen that with the Carnegies and the Rockefellers. And now we're going to see, what are presidents actually going to do about it? Because certainly we saw that the Sherman Antitrust Act really didn't do anything at all about it. So when Teddy was president, early in his presidency, he delivered this speech. And I want us to look at the end. He said it is based upon sincere conviction that combination and concentration, that means coming together basically in monopolies, should be not prohibited, but supervised and within reasonable limits controlled. And in my judgment, this conviction is right. So what Teddy is arguing is not that monopolies all need to be eliminated, but that they should actually be supervised. Now, it's a very important distinction that Teddy made. So here, of course, you see the teddy bear in the back picture carrying some wood, and you've got Hunter Teddy. Teddy is often pictured this way as he was an avid outdoorsman. And so you see that he's controlling the good trusts. If you see that little leash says restraint, but he's certainly gone out and hunted and killed the bad trusts. So in Teddy's mind, there was such thing as a good trust, and it's the kind of trust that provides services at a reasonable rate. So you can still have monopolies so long as they're not gouging the customer. Bad trusts, however, are the ones of the robber barons that, jack up their rates and use their monopolistic power to, have low wages and high prices and really hurt the consumers and employees. So one of the bad trusts that Teddy busted was J.P. Morgan. Really, he's up there with the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, even though he was much more the financier as opposed to owning or creating companies that made something. So Teddy goes after this Northern Securities Railroad, says it's a bad trust, and Supreme Court actually backs him. And this really helps Teddy get this reputation as a trust buster. Really helped this sort of big stick idea that he takes it to business. But in reality, he wasn't that much of a trust buster. He did bust some, very public, like this one. Taft, who comes after him, actually busts more trust in his 4 years than Teddy did in almost his 8. So I ask you, to what extent is this cartoon accurate? So no molly coddling. Basically, that means No acting cowardly here. Okay. So I'll let you evaluate that as part of the Ed Puzzle lecture. Now, here you have Teddy in his normal outdoorsy garb, okay? And he famously said, "The man should have youth and strength who seeks adventure in the wide waste spaces of the West." I guess again, sort of open in the marshes and among the vast mountain masses in the northern forests, amid the streaming jungles of the tropics, or a desert of sand or of snow. He must long greatly for the lonely winds that blow across the wilderness and for sunrise and sunset over the rim of the empty world. So Teddy actually had been a sick child and actually had been really restored by going out west to the Dakotas. He had a home in the Dakotas and was really seen as the first president that took a great interest in the outdoors. Now, we look here actually at what used to be a valley in Yosemite. Again, Yosemite being the second national park. And this valley is known as the Hetch Hetchy Valley. And if you look right here, okay, it gets dammed. So if you can see, it's exactly the same. It gets filled with water. And we're going to talk about why this really reflects Teddy's overall conservation philosophy. Keyword conservation. So he believed not in keeping it off limits from people. But he believed in using nature in a way that nature could be protected really from business development, but it could still serve the public. So he called this pragmatic conservation or multiple use resource management or pan utilization. And what I love about sort of the term multiple use resource management here is if you dammed this valley, then ultimately you could use it as drinking water for San Francisco, which was really growing at that time after the San Francisco fire. You could use it in terms of boating and fishing and potentially even swimming. So for Teddy, as long as it was really kept away from business interests, but it could be used for other things, that was really important. Now, he was opposed, sort of, I guess you could call it his frenemy, although it was much, much more his friend, but it was John Muir. And again, John Muir was the hospital where I was born on February 5th, 1978. But John Muir had a slightly different belief about nature. They both believed in nature. They both believed in the restorative power of nature. But John Muir was a preservationist as opposed to a conservationist. He really believed that when something is being preserved, it is kept totally apart and people could potentially hike in it and people could enjoy it, but it wouldn't be used as a reservoir or really anything else. So they both believed in nature and they worked very closely together, but one was much more of a conservationist in Teddy's case versus a preservationist in John Muir's case. And we'll get actually to the third member of this sort of pro-nature trio, and that's actually going to be Gifford Pinchot, and we'll get to him when we talk about what's known as the Pinchot-Ballinger affair under Taft. Now, something that's not even mentioned in your book at all, which is very concerning to me, is a very famous coal strike that occurs early in Teddy's presidency. So here you can see the miner with his back to us, the operator, the business owner right here. You can see the freezing public, because what had happened is that these coal miners went on strike and there wasn't enough coal to keep the country warm. And so here you have Uncle Sam basically saying, right now, listen to the public. You got to solve this. Now, what's very fascinating about this strike is not that it was the first strike. Clearly, we talked about Pullman strike. We talked about Homestead strike. But what's interesting in this 1902 coal strike is that when the coal miners went on strike asking for generally two of the main three elements of the Holy Trinity, higher wages and shorter work days, and for their union to be recognized. That's a big deal. Basically, you can have a union, but unless it's recognized by your company, it's really non-existent. Okay. And so as this strike threatened to shut down basically, all of warming up of the cities, Teddy said to them, miners, send your lead representatives. Mine owners, you are going to come to the White House to negotiate. And so if you look here, Teddy's biggest game, again, referring to him in his hunting garb, taking down the coal strike. Although I have no idea what kind of animal this is. Is it a horse? Is it a giant dog? Maybe I should make that an Ed puzzle question. What do we think? All right. So Teddy said to them, listen, if you don't actually get this back together, I'm going to send in the military to operate this mine to make sure that everybody has their coal. And in the end, sort of when Teddy played hardball, big stick policy again, folks, the miners received what they wanted. Okay, and that's good. Now, their trade union wasn't fully recognized, but they got a number of their demands. And the reason this is so significant is we'd seen so many times throughout the Gilded Age where just the federal government or state government's like, yeah, business owners, we got your back. We're with you. And the little guy kept getting screwed over. Now, in this case, the federal government, in the form of Teddy, basically served as a neutral arbitrator, trying to get both sides to get what they wanted. And so, even though it wasn't totally pro worker in the end, it was a sign that Teddy cared about the worker way more than, anybody in the White House had prior to that. Okay. So, thinking about what Teddy did as a trust buster, sort of thinking about what he did in terms of pro labor, this is a good example. Now, Teddy could have run for a full second term. Now, what's interesting here is there was no limit at this point about how many terms you could run for, but the tradition going all the way back to Washington was you only served for 2 terms. So Teddy could have run for that second full term, but he decided not to. He sort of went out on top. He was incredibly popular. And he chose William Howard Taft, who was in many ways sort of picked like Jackson picked Marty Van Buren way back in 1836. It was his sort of hand-picked successor. And so how do we go from like Teddy giving William Howard Taft the nomination, basically saying, you're my guy, Bill, to this 4 years later, where basically Teddy comes back again after having been on an African safari. And he says to Taft, like, give it back. I'm going to be president now. I don't care that you've been president for 4 years. So it comes down to basically 7 letters, okay? PA, BP, and USS. First, we're going to do PA. Now, we got to think about Taft. Taft was the heaviest president. You cannot spell Taft without FAT. There's the whole story about him getting stuck in a bathtub. Did not happen, but that's how many people know Taft. But Taft actually was way more of a trust buster and actually conserved more land than Teddy did, but he could never really win the hearts of the progressives. Now, the Payne-Aldrich tariff is a little bit confusing, okay? But what I want you to understand first and foremost is Democrats, again, representing, the dirty, dusty farmers, they've never liked tariffs. We know that. Progressives, even though Taft and Roosevelt were Republicans, the progressive Republicans didn't like tariffs either, okay? So Taft comes into the presidency and says, I want a lower tariff. Very consistent with the progressives, actually consistent with what the Democrats want. But there were some conservatives in Congress who basically didn't listen to Taft, and Taft didn't do much to actually get them to change their mind. So in the end, it results in what's known as the Payne-Aldrich tariff, which actually, while reducing some tariff rates slightly, actually raised them significantly. So even though Taft said, I want a much lower tariff, they actually came out with a higher tariff. So the progressives looking around, they're like, what? And they called out what was known as this fake tariff reform. So saying, you know what, at the end of the day, you sold us out, Taft. You said you were going to do one thing and you end up doing the other. You're not a true progressive. Okay, that's strike one. Now, strike two is, again, sort of a bizarre scandal. So we know that Taft takes over for Teddy. We know that the Secretary of the Interior, who's in charge of all federal lands, his name is Richard Ballinger. He looks at land that Teddy had removed from private development and basically is going to try to make it for sale so that private developers can buy it, helping out the federal government. So Gifford Pinchot, who'd been Teddy's director of forestry and really his good friend and sort of his aide de camp when it came to conservation. Again, I said that sort of trio of John Muir and Pinchot and Teddy and nature. So Pinchot goes to Taft to complain about this. So you can actually see this cartoon. Pinchot looking awfully like Hitler in a scary way, but he's standing at the top of the steps being, quite small and whiny compared to big old William Howard Taft, who actually wasn't even 6 feet tall. He says, I'm going to tell Teddy on you, sort of like, Teddy gave you the presidency and you're not doing what he wants. So Taft looks into the claims and just says, no, I don't believe these claims or they're not a problem. So Pinchot doesn't like it. He goes to the press, tries to get a whole bunch of sort of, congressional attention on it. And Taft's like, no, you don't get to go around my back that way. So in the end, it's like Ballinger wins and Pinchot loses, but this is seen really as sort of a referendum on like, Taft, are you keeping up with, the pro-nature policies of your predecessor? And again, he actually, got more land than Teddy did, but this was seen as a black mark as far as the progressives were concerned. So just the last piece is a little bit harder to understand, but remember I said that Teddy had his good trust and his bad trust. Well, he'd actually said that U.S. Steel was a good trust, and Taft went after it and said, "Nope, I'm going. I don't think it's a good one." So they actually went with a federal lawsuit. So this was seen as another betrayal. So Payne Aldrich, plus the Gifford Pinchot Richard Ballinger scandal, plus going after U.S. Steel, a supposedly good trust. So there was Fighting Bob La Follette, who we'd actually mentioned in the phoner text, and his Wisconsin plan, his Wisconsin idea. As governor of Wisconsin, he created so many different policies that were progressive, including sort of bringing in social science experts from University of Wisconsin to do a lot of the thinking about planning. Well, Fighting Bob was actually going to run as the progressive Republican against Taft. So again, even though Taft was the incumbent, Fighting Bob was going to run against him, and he was looking good. Look at that full head of hair. And then he basically had what sort of appeared to be a nervous breakdown. And that's all Teddy needed to come back in and basically be like, yeah, those progressives need someone to run, so I'm back. So what's interesting here, it's another picture of Fighting Bob. What's interesting about Teddy is, Teddy left sort of on a high note in 1909, goes to Africa, spends sort of like a year abroad, comes back. Everyone's like, Teddy, we love you. We want you to run again. He's like, I'm not running. I'm not running, guys. I'm not running. I'm not running. And he gives this actual speech in Osawatomie, Kansas, not to be confused with Pottawatomie, Kansas, back when crazy John Brown was killing 5 pro-slavers during Bleeding Kansas. But Teddy sort of makes a weird statement. He's sort of like, you know what? I thought I was a progressive back then, but I'm really a progressive now. And he uses a term that's very similar to what I've talked about a number of times about using the government as an agency of social welfare. He calls it a steward of public welfare. And what he effectively says is, even during my presidency, I don't think I went far enough to really, I had my square deal, my 3 C's, but I don't think I did enough. And in fact, this is when he actually starts sort of promoting women's suffrage as one of his sort of more progressive elements. Now, I want us to think back right here to the times that we have seen 4 candidates running for president as we do in 1912. So we remember, of course, the corrupt bargain. And those of you that had, I think, question number 5 in the 7 questions, you remember, of course, that this was part of what sort of fueled Andrew Jackson's rise back there when Clay, quote unquote, gave the presidency to JQA. In 1860, we saw the 2 Democrats, Breckinridge and Douglas, really split. Lincoln goes into the presidency. And in 1912, we're going to have a Democrat, Wilson. We're going to have a socialist, Eugene V. Debs, he, of course, of the Pullman strike, and then TR and Taft, who are both ostensibly Republicans. And Wilson's going to win, and let's talk about how that happens. So in 1912, it's really who's going to get the nomination. Is it incumbent Taft, who basically was given the keys to the presidency from Roosevelt, or Roosevelt, who's coming back around to basically serve for a 3rd time? And so Teddy needed less than 50% of these delegates to clinch the nomination. And he made this very famous speech about, almost interestingly, like William Jennings Bryan had done in 1896, also in Chicago, believe it or not. They had their conventions both in Chicago. We stand at Armageddon, we battle for the Lord. Well, Taft got almost all of those contested delegates. And in the end, that's not surprising, because when you are the incumbent president, usually control the machinery of the party. And so here you see this Republican Party bruised and battered, and you're going to sort of see 2 Republican parties. So Teddy's going to say, you know what, we're going to go off and have a different convention, much like we saw the Northern and Southern Democrats do way back in 1860 with Stephen Douglas and John Breckinridge. So Teddy calls his folks back to Chicago, the scene of the original crime, and says, you know what, I am as strong as a bull moose. So that's here now, Teddy. We've seen him, of course, as an outdoorsman. We've seen him with a teddy bear. We've seen him with a big stick. You always see him with the glasses, usually the big teeth. But here he is. He's saying, I'm strong as a bull moose, like, which is not a bull and a moose together. It's just a male moose. Okay. And in fact, Teddy was so strong that he was actually shot at, and he had a bunch of like papers in his jacket that sort of stopped the bullet. And he ended up giving the speech later that day. So Teddy was certainly, energetic and virile, and just, let's go get it done. But when we look at this particular image, we've got to understand sort of what it all means. Because if you take this sort of weakened elephant that you look at, and then you've got this uh, bull moose with Teddy's glasses on it. Okay. So you divide the Republican Party, you end up bringing in old Woody Wilson on a donkey. Okay. And Woodrow Wilson had been the governor of New Jersey for just a couple years only. He'd been the president of Princeton. He was really sort of seen as a progressive guy who took on corrupt New Jersey politics and cleaned it up. And so when you think about the three main candidates, not including Eugene V. Debs, who of course was probably more than progressive, probably pretty radical, it comes down to Teddy versus Woody. And one of the big differences had to do with monopolies. And I told you that, even when Teddy became a true progressive after Osawatomie, he still said that monopolies should be regulated, not all eliminated. Whereas Woody said, no, they should be totally eliminated. So new nationalism, Teddy's plan, regulation. New freedom, Woodrow Wilson's plan, they should be eliminated altogether. Okay. So Woodrow Wilson called for an attack on what he called the triple wall of privilege. Now, this is a little weird because, quite frankly, this is not all three of them: privilege, tariff, and trust. It's actually banking's tariff and trust. He wanted to reform the banking system. He wanted a lower tariff, and he wanted to get rid of trust, monopolies. So here you actually see, instead of the triple wall of privilege, it's the triple pales of privilege: antitrust legislation, tariff legislation, and currency legislation. And it comes for what is known as priming the pump, where you actually got to put some water into the pump to get the pump going, to get more water out or get more oil out of the ground. So this was seen as Wilson's attempt to really get the economy going. So the first part is he actually lowers a tariff. Again, whereas Taft hadn't with Payne Aldrich, Woodrow Wilson does. But what's more interesting about this tariff is, and this is hard to understand, but when an amendment gets ratified, it just means the government has the power to do it. So the 16th Amendment, which had actually been sort of supported under Taft, and right as he's going out of office is about to get ratified, the 16th Amendment just gave the government the power to do what's known as a graduated income tax, which means that the wealthy would pay much more than the poor. This was seen as a much more fair way to do it. But the tariff had a provision in it that allowed the government to actually execute this particular income tax. So the 16th Amendment allowed the government to do it. The Underwood-Simmons tariff actually made it do it. I know it's weird. The same thing happened with prohibition. The 18th Amendment allowed for prohibition, but what's known as the Volstead Act actually put it into practice. Okay. Then you have the Federal Reserve Act, which in many ways calls on first BOTUS, second BOTUS, and even Lincoln's national banking system. This one is even more comprehensive. It's going to have different regional banks, which are all going to basically answer to what is known as the Fed, or the Federal Reserve. And the big part that we understand now about the Fed is that it sets interest rates to try to jumpstart or rein in the economy. And again, we'd seen so many panics from 1819, 1837, 1857, 1873, and 1893, and even some early in 1900s. The thinking is that if you actually had this more sort of comprehensive banking system, that the Fed could react much more quickly, unlike basically the government ever did during those panics. Now, this is not part of the triple wall of privilege or triple pales of privilege, but the Federal Trade Commission Act was basically to sort of be a tester to determine, like if you start a company or if you're doing something, you could basically go to the Federal Trade Commission and find out, is what I'm doing kosher? Is it legal? And then, of course, the FTC could actually go after unfair trade practices. So again, protecting the consumer. One of the really big deals was the Clayton Antitrust Act. And for whatever reason, it's just known as the Clayton Act in Foner. But this was really, really important, particularly to labor, because not only did it go after monopolies, which is a big deal, but it didn't go after labor. So it's known as the Magna Carta of labor. In fact, there are two Magna Cartas of labor. So this is the 1.0. And so the important part here is that labor unions and agricultural cooperatives, that's sort of like something that came out of the Grange, they couldn't be considered a restraint on trade. Again, that was the whole legal logic that had been used in the Sherman Antitrust Act to go after, unions like we saw at Pullman. And it says at the end of the day that striking is not illegal. So this is incredibly important, not just for going after trusts, which was a big deal under Wilson, but really sort of opening up opportunities for labor. So we saw certainly under Roosevelt, we saw the anthracite coal strike sort of, not coming down on either side, but trying to mediate from the middle. And then Wilson signing in the Clayton Antitrust Act, which is incredibly important for labor. Now, I just want to finish with this slide because I know that throughout the course of the different progressive lectures, we mentioned a bunch of different amendments, but the 16th Amendment allowed for an income tax. And then what you saw was the Underwood-Simmons tariff that allowed that to go into play. The direct election of senators, 17th Amendment, goes along with, ideas like we saw the initiative and the referendum and the recall and the direct primary and this Australian secret ballot. Again, making sure that the people, not state legislatures, would elect the two senators from every state. Prohibition, certainly as a result of what we saw with, the Anti-Saloon League and the Women Christian Temperance Union. And then ultimately World War I sort of pushing that across the finish line. So prohibition is allowed by the 18th Amendment, but something called the Volstead Act will actually be the law that puts it into practice. And then, of course, the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage, which we talked about in the last lecture, coming again sort of as a somewhat of a patronizing thank you at the end of World War I.